Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of All Things Policy. I'll be your host for today, and my name is Kripa Koshy, and I'm a staff program manager here at the Takshashila Institution, where I manage our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy. Today, I actually have the pleasure of having a conversation with one of my colleagues in the policy school here, who's going to be discussing with me a fairly critical issue that's come up when looking at public finance sort of management. So before I go into introduction, I'm just going to say a warm welcome to Sarthak. Pleasure to have you, Sarthak.
Hi, Kripa.
Hello. So
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, a real pleasure to have you here, Sarthak. And I know for those who've been following some of your research, you might be a familiar name. But just to introduce those who may not know him, Sarthak Pradhan is a assistant professor at Takshashila. And here he's quite busy with a few things, including teaching economic reasoning, as well as doing, important for our discussion today, a fair bit of research into public finance. So Sarthak, as I mentioned, I've been a bit mysterious maybe and said we're just going to discuss a critical issue in public financial management, but really what we're here to discuss is off-budget borrowings. For those who may not know, off-budget borrowings, or OBBs as it's sometimes called, is usually when public sector entity borrows funds outside of the immediate oversight of government budget or inclusion in the government budget, even though it's understood that the government is ultimately guaranteeing or servicing the debt. We've actually seen this is not something brand new, when you're thinking of the public finance landscape in India, because we see that successive finance commissions have been concerned about this practice generally, and even the reporting around it has been a point of concern. But why do governments actually regularly use, sort of off-budget borrowings? What's the impact that it actually has on India's economic growth? How can governments actually better navigate what seems to be a fairly complex public finance maze? So no pressure, Sarthak, but to answer all of this and more, I've invited you to join us. Maybe the simple question right off the bat, maybe it seems simple to us, but there is some nuance and complexity here. What really is off-budget borrowing?
Yeah, thanks, Kripa. In fact, you defined it already. But anyway, for our listeners who are new to this particular term, off-budget borrowing, I just want to talk about what is budget, right? If you know the idea of budget, then it is easy for us to understand what is off-budget. So every year, both the union government, state governments, they present the budget. So typically in the month of February, April, generally they will March, April. That is the time when they present the budget, and this budget is basically a complete, transparent record of the revenue that the government is going to raise and the expenditure it is going to incur. And the idea is the legislature will hold the executive accountable, right? What are they supposed to spend on? Where are they spending on? Whether there is any divergence over there. So those kind of things. But sometimes what happens, the governments might borrow in such a way. They might not be directly borrowing it. They will be creating certain entities, or they will be borrowing through some separate entity, as a result of which the burden is borne by the government. But the economic repayment is by the government, but it will not be reflected in the budget books, right? So it's kind of a trick. So the governments might have a public sector entity or a special purpose vehicle or a body like the Food Corporation of India, which will be borrowing the money, which will be maybe spending the money, but all these things will not be reflected in the government's budget. So all these things are outside the legislature's control. And in all the different calculations, for instance, the fiscal deficit calculations, all these things don't get reflected. Technically, it is a borrowing of the government, but these calculations, fiscal deficit calculations, the targets for arriving at those, for whether you're meeting those targets or not, all these things don't get reflected here. So that is what off-budget borrowing is. And for a very long period of time, the Food Corporation of India, it used to borrow from the National Small Savings Fund. So the food subsidy was not getting reflected in the union budget. If you look at CAG reports in the 2010s, you will find this thing being flagged multiple times. But yeah, recently they have changed it. Yeah, it was a recurring thing. The union government has actually taken some steps in the last few years, and they have now brought it within the main budget.
Went to the budget. Yeah, I think one of the things that we briefly spoke of, like, what could an analogy be for something like this? It's almost like having sort of a secret credit card that you don't really disclose. You're putting all of these major payments on it, and yet when you look at your bank account, perhaps it looks a little bit squeaky clean. But I mean, clearly there's some rationale here for why governments think this is a prudent way to report and manage their spending. So why typically do you find governments sort of under pressure to do, maybe they're under pressure to do something like this, or why do they choose this reporting mechanism?
So Kripa, that analogy is very nice, very good analogy. But one thing, in the bank accounts also, it will get reflected when you are paying the credit card
the final
bills,
clearing your statements,
clearing the bills, right? At some point in time, you have to clear the bills, right? So when you clear the bills in your bank statement, it will get reflected. Maybe immediately it is not getting reflected. When the payment is due, you will be in a fix. But interesting question: why do governments typically do that? In fact, we can look at it from two angles, right? What is the need for the government to do it? And the second thing is what allows governments to do it, right? So what are those ecosystem related things that allows the government to do it and it doesn't face any repercussions maybe? So first is, what is the need? One is, typically there is a need for different kinds of, not need exactly, but there's a demand for different kinds of subsidies. Everyone wants stuff which is cheaper maybe, which is free maybe. So there is a persistent and growing demand for subsidy, and you don't have that much fiscal space to provide for these subsidies. And so you figure out ways. You are spending money, but you don't have that much revenue, so you are borrowing. And again, if you observe in the last few years, the kind of subsidies that are being provided by different state governments, also promised by the union governments, it has been on the rise. The second thing is, again, the kind of governments we have had. We have public sector entities, right? At the union level, at the state level, we have had public sector entities. They have been running. Many of them are loss making. So you tend to finance those public sector utilities. It's politically difficult to close some of these things. So these entities are not making money, but they're not they're not raising revenue, but you're operating them, so you need money for that. So financing public sector utilities is also one of the reasons why you continue with OBPs. Now the question is, what are those things which allow, or which kind of gives a leeway for the governments to continue with OBPs? And again, here there are multiple factors. Many of these things you can relate to different public finance theories. For instance, one is the concept of fiscal illusion. Typically, how do voters evaluate government performance? They will be evaluating it based on indicators, factors that is visible to them. Maybe they will look at many scenarios. Citizens don't even evaluate these numbers, but if someone has to evaluate, they will look at numbers which are out there. And off-budget borrowing is something which is not there. So if you don't have a sense of that, you will feel everything is going fine.
Right. And you feel like your government is very prudently managing its resources.
Yeah, managing everything, right? Yeah. And the burden is not directly on you, because that impact, whatever the government is borrowing through this channel, that impact will be maybe across generations, right? So immediately you are not feeling the thing. So you cannot evaluate, you cannot sense any problem right now. So that fiscal illusion helps you continue with that. If I'm looking at it from the incentive of the politicians, the policymakers, right? So for them, what is that political time horizon? It is 5 years. But the borrowing, the effect of that borrowing, it will last for some 15, 20 years. It gets divided between that, right? So for me, the incentive is next 5 years, how much I can spend.
That's right.
And the implication will be for the next 15, 20 years.
And sweep it under the rug and then see when the next government comes in.
And it gets divided. The benefits are, you're getting it within 5 years, maybe, next year, maybe, but the cost is being borne across
multiple
generations, or at least a longer time period. Thirdly, how are these entities, how are the states able to borrow, right? Because if someone doesn't lend them money, they can't borrow. But the different kind of public sector entities of the governments, right, or special purpose vehicles of the government, how are they able to borrow, right? If they are not having enough money to borrow, then they can't borrow, and this OBBs will not happen. But here what happens, since it is public sector entities or it is special purpose vehicles, there is an implicit assumption that they have a government backing. And if they're not able to repay the loans, the government will eventually bail them out. So this is what we call as soft budget constraints, right? So this is what happens. Additionally, there is this common pool problem in the sense that every actor, the ministers, PSU, states, they have an incentive to extract resources through whatever channel. So there are many claimants to that exchequer. So everyone tries to figure out ways, and OBBs help you in that. And on top of that, there are some institutional mechanisms, or we can say not enough strong institutional mechanisms which let it happen. For instance, maybe CAG can flag it that this is what is happening. In fact, CAG reports talk about off-budget borrowing,
Right.
but they don't have any binding power or enforcement power. It is eventually the executive which has to do it, right? And last point. So to ensure that we are not going overboard when it comes to debts deficits, we have imposed we have some laws. That is the Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management laws, FRBM laws. And according to that, the revenue deficit should not be there. Fiscal deficit should be less than 3%. All these targets are imposed. Now, when you have these targets and your spending requirements are quite high, your revenue is not that much, you don't have that much fiscal space, what will you do? You will try to figure out ways by which you can game the targets, maybe.
Right.
And off-budget...
And creatively access.
Creatively, yeah. It's kind of a creative accounting, you can say, or not creative accounting, but a creative way by which you can breach these targets. So off-budget borrowings allow for that. So they don't get counted as part of the expenditure to arrive at the fiscal deficit numbers. And so there is a leeway.
No, and this is really interesting. And I was hoping maybe we can ground, now that it's really good to have a bit of an outline of how OBBs sort of play out in governmental context. Maybe if we can pull up some evidence that, comes to mind for you of, I know, those who've been following the news recently may have seen examples of Maharashtra or Kerala who've been pulled up by various CAG reports. Similarly, like you said, that the CAG has flagged a few of these instances of OBB reporting. But do you think there's some really salient evidence you can pull to help us ground some of the concerns around this?
Yeah, so you have correctly pointed out CAG reports typically talk about all these off-budget borrowings. Apart from that, for the 16th Finance Commission, there was a study by the World Bank, which looked at, I think, 10 or 12 states, and they identified what is the extent of off-budget borrowings. For instance, they pointed out that Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, for them, the off-budget borrowing is around 10 to 11% of their state domestic product.
Wow.
Right. And many states don't even report these things, or they will be underreporting
Sure. Or misreporting also, because simply they've categorized the spending elsewhere.
Yeah, that can also happen. For instance, the CAG audit of 2023-24 of Maharashtra, right? They found out that in 2019-20, Maharashtra had reported some 19 crores as their off-budget borrowing. But they find out that it was actually 51 crores, like almost 2.5 times. And that has increased to around 10,000 crores by 23-24.
Yeah.
Right? And I think recent news articles, they are saying that it is around 51,000 crores Maharashtra's off-budget borrowing. So that kind of quantum change has been there, and it has been increasing. Kerala's case, again, has been very interesting. There have been instances where Kerala has said that there is no off-budget borrowing. It told the Finance Commission that there is no off-budget borrowing. But then Kerala has used another route to borrow, Infrastructure Investment Fund Board, and that borrowing is around 25,000 crores. So there has been a tussle between the Kerala government and the union government, and that case is right now going in the Supreme
Playing
Court.
Out. Right, that's what we were reading. Yeah, I was seeing in some news reports on this.
So the Attorney General says that because of these kind of borrowings, Kerala is the most financially unhealthy state. This is what the Attorney General had said at one point.
Which is so interesting, because then a lot of the messaging from the government side is we're probably the most fiscally clean and transparent too, because if they've reported no OBBs at all, there's clearly a dissonance there between what's reported and what actually has been assessed and found to be true for the CAG report.
Yeah, and also point to be noted, we mentioned about mostly the southern states. It doesn't mean that only the southern states are doing this.
Right.
Northern states might also be doing it, but just that data is not there, or we have not been able to figure out these things. So, for instance, Madhya Pradesh, I think there was a World Bank report which says that under some heading, minor head 800, others, Madhya Pradesh, 15% of its expenditure is under that head. Others expenditure. So you don't know what is that expenditure, and it seems like weird to have like 15% expenditure over there.
Right. And I mean, see, having such an opaque sort of system, like you said, has had so many ripple effects and holds potential risk. And I think some folks might be seeing it, especially those who, I mean, if you ask for, certain political leadership, perhaps they'll say, look, this is a big fuss being made around what's a very straightforward accounting practice. So it's not such a threat really to how, financial management is working in the country. But what would you say are some of the more concerning risks that, governments should be mindful of when taking this route of choosing OBBs?
So again, if I look at risks, I look at it at multiple angles or at multiple levels, I would say. One is at a slightly philosophical level or maybe governance level. That is, whatever the government is spending, whatever the executive is spending, they should be accountable for that, right? Whatever money is being spent, it is at the end of the day your money, my money. And we have paid taxes, we have paid, and again, maybe we availed some services and we paid charges for that, so non-taxes. So it's our money. So our representatives should have a tab on those things, right? For instance, my member of parliament, right, should hold them account. So legislative scrutiny control should be there. But when all these things are outside the budget, so legislature cannot scrutinize these things. That is outside its control. So in a broader sense, this is a way by which democracy is not functioning as it is, right? As it should be. It is somewhere getting weakened. That's what democracy is, right? I am selecting my representatives. They are deciding on what kind of things they should be allocating the money on. Somewhere that thing is getting misaligned. Additionally, it also creates disincentives, or it creates circumstances where resources can get allocated in a distorted manner. For instance, if something is outside the legislative control, then why will that stop? It will never stop. It will just increase. If subsidies are routed through a mechanism which is outside legislative scrutiny, it is bound to just increase. Again, the rate of increase can change, but it is going to increase. There is no real trade-off.
Because there's no check and balance against how that is going to be used.
Yeah, there's no check and balance. Yeah, and there's no trade-off, right? When you're saying that, okay, you're spending X amount on health or Y amount on education. So if you increase spending on health, maybe spending on some other thing will get reduced. If you're increasing spending on education, some spending on something else will get reduced, right? So you are balancing all these things. But if something is outside, there is no trade-off, there is no balancing happening. Apart from that, all these off-budget borrowings, right? They are being done through public sector units or special purpose vehicles, other mechanisms. And all these institutions might not be audited as rigorously as, let's say, Ministry of Health is getting scrutinized, right? So CAG and other audits might not. So there is no incentive for them to also deliver these things efficiently and effectively. So these are all accountability, governance related issues that I find. But then there is also a massive economic risk. There are different economic repercussions of this. For instance, now, generally what different credit rating agencies, they try to rate how credit worthy a state is or a federal government is, right? Now, they will use certain parameters, for instance, GDP ratio or debt to GSDP ratio, those things they will use. But now, if the borrowing is happening outside of, outside the budget, right? The actual debt is not getting reflected in these numbers. As a result,
in turn, the downstream impact.
Yeah, the actual situation is not getting revealed. So your credit rating might be really good, but you are not that good. But at some point of time, your real situation, the actual situation will get revealed. At that time, the markets will reprice abruptly. You will have a discontinuous shock.
Yeah.
Instead of a smooth adjustment, maybe a discontinuous shock. So it will be a crisis kind of a situation.
Right.
So why do you want to not avoid that or avoid that kind of a crisis? It's like that thing, no? That yeah, I mean, whatever. So you are not getting sense of the real problem. And your liability is also increasing. You don't have a real picture. It's going to lead to different kind of sovereign balance sheet issues.
Right.
Further, these entities, PSUs or SPVs, right? They don't have a credit rating like as compared to a state government or a union government. Their credit rating might not exist or might not be that good. As a result of which, they might be getting the loans at a higher rate of interest, which is again not prudent. And lastly, all these has intergenerational implications. You are spending right now, you are spending maybe lavishly. There will be implications on the future generations. Why are you punishing them? I mean, they don't deserve it, right? So it is not fair for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a bit of an insidious sort of like trap to be stuck in, right? Especially, I would imagine if you're in a state where a neighboring state is being very creative in some of their accounting, is able to do this very extravagant kind of spending. There is a question that a government may ask then of themselves to say, hey, if they are able to be a bit creative in how they're able to access resources and how they report those resources, then why not for our state as well? And I can see how the incentives already are set up in really a bit of a problematic way here. I think maybe is there any last point maybe on this?
One thing. I just wanted to add here because we have been talking a lot about states and we have not been talking about the union, right? It's not that union also doesn't engage in off-budget borrowing.
Right,
the union government was also engaging in off-budget borrowing, but over the last few years they have changed things. In fact, the 2021-22 budget speech, the finance minister announced that certain kinds of things which were off budget will now be part of the budget. Wow. For instance, the NSSF loan to Food Corporation of India for food subsidy that was brought into the accounts, right? So from 2021-22 onwards, the off-budget borrowing of the union government has essentially decreased massively. However, for states, it continues to remain and it has been on the rise. So that's the reason why we have been discussing a lot about states. Right. This for the listeners. So it's not that union can't do it; they can also do it. But good thing is union has actually brought all these things, or they have made things much more transparent. Right. It also implies that the states can also do it.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's fantastic to see then an example of that playing out in the public context and how the downstream impact of that also could be. I think the question I'm sure a lot of listeners may have on mind is, well, this is the state of affairs as it stands for my state, or for now we've said also for the union government. What does it look like for governments to possibly make their way out of this? What are sort of the ways out? Like, I mean, prudent reporting and taking to heed what CAG recommendations are is one thing. But are there any other recommendations that you think are as a possible way out of this maze?
So you have correctly pointed this out. See, borrowing in itself is not a problem. But the problem is if there is government-backed borrowing, which is escaping some form of accountability. That is the problem. So we need to figure out the accountability boundaries. The accountability boundary needs to be well defined. And it has to be defined in maybe economic terms. For instance, in some countries, what they do, if there is an entity whose revenue or spending or repayment is controlled by the government, it is considered to be a government debt. Right? So, for instance, in case of, let's say, some state, there is a public sector entity of the state, which is basically getting revenue from the government. Maybe all its spending decisions is decided by the government, or the repayment will be done by the government. Then it should be considered, whatever borrowing it has done, it should be part of the government debt. So, you have to be clear about the accounting boundary, what all should be considered government debt, what all can be excluded. If there is some clarity, and it has to be on economic terms. Legal terms can get confusing and it can be used to avoid. Second thing is there needs to be some institution outside the executive to keep a tab. because executive, its inherent incentive will be to ensure that they do these things, right? Certain institution
Right.
outside, independent, should keep a tab. Apart from that, we should have some consolidated numbers so that there is no incentive for you to move the incentive from one boundary to another.
Right.
Right. So there's no incentive of moving the liabilities from one point to another. So a net of on budget and off budget liabilities, if you have a single number, that makes sense. So there are countries which have done their countries, and there are other examples of these kind of things. For instance, in the European Union, if there is an entity where more than 50% of the costs are covered by the sales revenue, then again, it's a separate entity. But if it is 50% of its costs are not covered by its own sales revenue, then it is considered to be general government debt. Right? So those kind of things have been done. In UK, the different kinds of public corporations debt has to be included as part of the government debt. Previously, it was not there, or for some public corporations, it was not included. And later on, it was included. For instance, the network rails debt was reclassified into the public balance sheet in 2014, and overnight, some 30 billion pounds debt got included, was reported there. Right? And some other countries, for instance, New Zealand, they will have very explicit, they have a Fiscal Responsibility Act, and they require explicit statements of the different kinds of fiscal risks, contingent liabilities, right? Because these are all contingent liabilities. So they have all those details. Right. So these are some of the things that India can possibly do. For instance, you can take inspiration from these things. So when you're calculating, let's say, or when you are trying to finding out the metrics that you should track under the fiscal responsibility and budgetary management laws, right? So maybe you should have an entity that covers the overall contingent or overall liabilities, should include all the contingent liabilities as well. So maybe that can give you a sense of the situation. Additionally, maybe, and this is something which has been recommended by committees in the past, finance commissions have also recommended it. Finance commissions, in fact, the 16th Finance Commission also talks about it, that we should have a body which is called the Fiscal Council, which Dr. Rao, the counselor of Takshashila Institution, he also talks about it. NK Singh Committee in 2017 also recommended it. These fiscal councils are independent bodies. They evaluate government spending, they evaluate government revenues as well, right? What kind of ways are being used where to raise revenue, what are things that are used to spend money. So these bodies are independent. World over, you have different countries using these kind of mechanisms. Maybe it is time for India to also have such an institution. Apart from that, just like in New Zealand, you have this comprehensive coverage, right? Different kinds of liabilities, all these things are included, explicit risks are mentioned. Maybe we should also move towards that. So yeah, these are some of the things that we can possibly do, maybe learn from some of the models outside.
Yeah, and those are fantastic examples, Sarthak. So thank you for being, so comprehensive about trying to pull from different contexts. I think it is really encouraging to see, like you mentioned, the Union government has done some of this disclosure, has been making this effort to do what is a fairly challenging thing for governments to do in some ways, which is, no one wants to be the first person to bell the cat and put their hand up and say, actually, we want to disclose some figures that might be a bit ugly for the public to look at. But I think you really clearly outlined, that there's a really strong rationale for why governments, regardless of what level of government, should be as transparent as possible with some of their spending and should create a space for that spending to be held accountable, in some way. So really, in the interest of time, I'm going to maybe wrap up our conversation here, although I know there's so many nuances to be captured in when we're talking about OBBs. But thanks so much for making it so clear and sort of outlining it for our listeners. And for those who are interested, I'm sure there's a lot more research out there. The World Bank report that Sarthak mentioned, I'm sure, is one excellent resource to also go and explore. And hopefully this has made the world of OBB slightly a little bit clearer to understand. But with that, I'll say thank you so much to our guests. Thank you, Sarthak, for joining us.
Thanks, Kripa, for having me for this episode.
Thank you. A pleasure to have you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, folks.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.